Hey guys, my name's Devin. I am a aspiring level designer, and today I'm going to show you a Kismet script that uses Boolean variables for the most part to get the sequence working. This is going to be a part of a long series of tutorials I'll be making about all the different variable types available to you in Kismet. So the first one is Booleans. So what it is in the scene here you can see that there are 3 pokeballs on a shelf and then our door, and on the wall it says pokeballs open doors. So what the script does is the player can pick up a pokeball and then approach the door and try to open it. Now only one pokeball actually works as our key, which is the middle one right here, and the other 2 don't work. So if the player goes to the door with the middle pokeball and presses the E key, the door will open, but if he approaches the door with the left or right pokeballs and approaches the door and presses E, the door will not open. So let me jump in and give it a test. Okay, so let me pick up the first Pokeball. You press E, and it disappears. That means you have it in your possession. And then you go up to the door, and it says press E to open the door if you have the correct Pokeball. So if I'm not sure, I'm gonna press the E key, and it tells me I have the wrong Pokeball. So I go back, and if I try to pick up another Pokeball, it tells me I can only carry one at a time. So I'll place this one back, and now I'll pick up the correct Pokeball that I know is correct. Now I go back to the door, press the E key, and it opens. And now if you notice, it won't say anything about carrying one Pokeball at a time, and I can't do anything. That's because I destroyed all the triggers once the puzzle has been solved. So that's basically the script. So I'll show you the Kismet script really quick in Kismet, and then we're going to recreate it. So let's open up Kismet. And all this is our sequence. It may look like a lot, but a lot of it's just copy and pasted. So really quick, an overview. We have our initial variables here. We have Boolean variables for all 3 Pokeballs, and then a Boolean variable to whether or not the player has a Pokeball. I'll go into more detail when we start scripting. And then here we have the initial used trigger event that basically lets you pick up the Pokeball, or at least makes you think you have picked it up. It actually just hides the Pokeball, and then when you put it back it unhides it, so it kind of gives the illusion that you have it picked up. And I have this for all 3 Pokeballs. So it essentially does the same thing but for each individual Pokeball. And then over here we just have the touch events for the triggers, so when you touch it, it'll either say pick up the Pokeball, or if you have a Pokeball, it'll say place down the Pokeball, or you can't carry any Pokeballs, or you can't carry more than one Pokeball. And I do that for all 3 Pokeballs. And then the last thing I do is the door sequence, so when you touch the door initially, it'll tell you, okay, press E to open the door if you have the correct Pokeball. And then when you press E, this is when we start comparing things. We compare whether or not the player has the right Pokeball, and if they do, the door will open. But if the player doesn't have the right Pokeball, it'll tell you you have the wrong Pokeball. And if you don't have any Pokeballs, it'll say you don't have a Pokeball. And then over here is our matinee animation for our door opening. And then lastly, this is where we destroy our triggers for once the player has solved our puzzle. So it seems like a lot, but once we go into it, you'll see that it's fairly simple. So why don't we jump in, and I'll show you how to recreate this entire scene from scratch, and then our Kismet sequence from scratch. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new scene. So we go up to the top left here at this blank page icon, create a new level, left click that, and then unlike my other tutorials, I'm not going to use a default map. I'm actually going to go into a blank map, and that's because I want to start everything from scratch, and it kind of hurts us having a default area like this. So I'm going to go to blank map. I'm going to save my level. Now let me get out of game mode, and when you open up a blank map, this is what you get. You get a red builder brush and just a blue grid that goes on almost infinitely. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change our game type to UT game, so we have access to the gun and the game type so that we can correctly reference it in Kismet, and when we play it, everything will run appropriately. To do that, go up to View, then go down to World Properties, and then within our world info, scroll down until you find game type, and then change both default game type and game type for PIE, which stands for Play in Editor. Change both of those to UT game. Now that we have our game type set, we can go into our content browser. And for this tutorial, I used some unique objects that I created. The pokeball, the shelf, and then the decal on the wall telling you that pokeballs open the doors. So in order to do that, included on the tutorial page on my portfolio, as well as the link in the description below, is a link to my Dropbox, which is a package file that contains both the level that I just showed you and the level package that you'll need that contains the pokeball and the textures and all of that. It's an external package. In our content browser, go down to the bottom here and hit this folder icon, and it's open an external package. Click that and then find the bool tutorial package.upk and then hit open. I'm gonna get an error because I already have it open, but you should not get an error, and it should appear down here under a new folder called external packages. It just didn't create one for me because I already have it in my asset library. So in here you will find a bunch of textures for the shelves, the pokeballs, and the decal material on the wall. So everything you need is in here. So let's start putting together our scene. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to get rid of this builder brush. I'm just going to move it out of my way because we'll be using static meshes instead of BSB geometry. So over here, select UDK game, and then click static mesh, check it so we filter just static meshes, and then I'm going to type in floor in our search bar, and then scroll through the content browser until I find the floor that I want. And it's this one right here, S_LT_floors_SM_tile floor broken _4x4. So I'm going to drag that out. And then the size of the room is going to be a 2x2 square of this floor piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and then I'm going to left click drag out a duplicate and just snap it on. As you can see down here, my snap is at 2 Unreal units, which isn't good right now. So in order to increase it, you just have to hit the right bracket key on your keyboard, and it'll increment up by 2. So I want to be at 16. So now I'm going to select both floor pieces by hitting Control and left clicking the other piece to select multiple selections. So now I'm going to hit Alt again, hold it, and then left click drag on the X axis to bring out another 2. So now I have my 4x4. So I'm going to hold down the L key and then left click on the floor, and it will create a light for me. I'm just going to drag that up, and it's basic light right now. We're going to change its properties in a little bit, but I wanted to put in a light so I can see everything under lit mode. So now what we need is we're going to need walls. So back in our content browser, take away floor and type in wall. And I want this wall piece right here, S_LT_buildings_SM_bunker wall A_STR for straight. So I'm going to left click, drag that onto my scene, and I'm going to place them along my floors on the outer edges. So I'm going to do that real quick. Using the same techniques to select multiple objects and drag duplicate objects as well. Okay, now that we have our wall set up, I want to set up a ceiling. Back in our content browser, let's type in ceiling, and I want this one right here, S_LT_floors_SM_floor ceiling_simple. Left click, drag it out. And how this mesh works, if we look at it from the bottom, you can see through it. There's not a lot of geometry there. So what I want to do is I want to rotate it on the Z axis. So go to the rotation widget by pressing the space bar and then rotate it this way so that the top face is facing downward, so when we look up at it, you see the detail of the material and the mesh itself. And then one problem with this mesh right now is that it's not big enough to fit our size of the room. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to these 4 ones. These represent the scaling of the object. The first one represents the whole scale of the object itself. So if I made this 2 instead of 1, all axes would be multiplied by 2. Now the next 3 ones represent x, y, and z respectively. So this one, if I turn it to 2, the mesh will become twice as big in the x-axis, and then the next one's y, and then the last one's z. So what I want to do is I want to make this mesh twice as big in all axes. So I'm going to change this one to a 2. As we can see, it's twice as big now. So I'm going to position it so that it's really good. That looks decent. So I'm going to move our light more into our scene. So now I'm going to take out a light source. And by a light source, I mean a mesh that represents a light, so that our light in the game isn't coming from nowhere, it's coming from an object. So we're in our content browser, let's type in light. Scroll down until you find s_hu_light_sm_wall_light01. Drag that out. And I also made this twice as big, just so you can see it better. So I'm going to drag that in, place it against the wall, and bring it up slightly. So now I'm going to move the light towards the light mesh. And now I'm going to, with the light selected, I'm going to press F4 to open its properties. And I'm going to change the radius from 1024 to 512. Its brightness to 2, and then its color I'm going to change it to a light yellow color so that it represents the same color as this light here. Now that we have that set up, we're going to set up our doorway. So I'm going to select this wall right here, and I'm just going to delete it. So now that we have an opening for our doorway and our door. So let's type in door in our content browser, scroll down until you find s_lt_doors_sm_door04. Left click, drag that out, and then also take out s_lt_doors_sm_doorway_04. Drag that out, and these meshes are made in conjunction with one another, so they fit pretty perfectly together. So I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to move them into position. Okay, now that we have our doorway set up, we can start to set up our pokeballs and our shelf. So now go down until you find Bool tutorial package, and you should find pokeball and the shelf if static mesh is still checked. I have it in my asset library. You should find it under a package called external packages. So go to the Bool tutorial package, and let's drag out the shelf. Then the shelf itself, it's pretty small, so let's make it twice as big, and that should work. But let's also make it twice as big in the Y, so that the shelf is pretty big. And I'm going to place it next to the door. Now I'm going to drag in a pokeball. And the pokeball size is pretty large as well. So I'm going to drop that down in all axes to 0.15. So now it's at a decent size for a pokeball. And then I'm going to hit space to rotate it. So I'm going to rotate it so that the button here is facing outwards. And I'm just using pokeballs because I thought it would be fun for me just to be looking at pokeballs the entire time. You can use any mesh you want. So I'm going to put this into position. And I'm going to Alt left click drag 2 duplicates of this pokeball and put them on the shelf here. What we're going to do now is we're going to set up triggers for our events, and there's going to be a total of 4. One for the door here, and one for each of these pokeballs. So now right click in our scene, go down to add actor, and then add trigger. Alright, with this first trigger, I want you to press F4 with the trigger selected to get to its properties. And now, what we're going to do here, under collision height, let's change that to 16. And then collision radius, change that to 91. So now that's set up, let's drag it to the door, so that's right in front of the door, a little upwards so it's in front of the player. And now I'm going to hit Alt, left click, drag a duplicate of this. Now under the scaling on the bottom here, it's actually just the draw scale, and when I do this with objects like a light or a trigger, if I make this 0.25, it just changes the size of the icon for me. And that's what I want, just to make it as small as the pokeball. And now press F4 again, and we're going to change its collision radius to 16, and we're going to keep its collision height the same. So now it's relatively small. So now I want you to Alt, left click, drag duplicates 2 more times. Now we have our 3 triggers. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to convert all 3 pokeballs and or door itself into interactors so that we can reference them in Kismet. So I'm going to click on the door, right click on it, and then I'm going to convert static mesh actor to mover. Now it is an interactor, and if you watch my previous videos you'll know that when an object is converted from a static mesh to an interactor, it loses its collision. So with the doorway selected, I want to hit F4, and now in the search bar at the top, type in collision, and then find the collision type parameter and change it from collide underscore no collision, change that to collide underscore block all. So now if the player goes into the level, they won't be able to go through the door until it's open. And with the Pokeballs themselves, they don't need collision because you won't be interacting with them that much, to the point where if you went through it, it doesn't really matter. Now we have to convert our Pokeballs into to interactors from static mesh actors. So I'm going to select all 3 of them, holding Control and left clicking to select multiple objects. Then I'm going to right click, convert static mesh to mover. Now this will convert all of them to interactors. The last thing we're going to need is a player start, and so that we can have a place to spawn in when we play it in editor. So right click, go to add actor, add player start. Now that we have a player start in our scene, hit space to rotate, and then let's move the arrow so it's facing forward, because wherever this arrow is pointing is the direction you're going to face once you spawn in. So now that that's in here, let's build all. And this builds paths, it builds lighting, and it builds geometry. So now everything's set up. So that's our scene. So go up to Kismet, open it. I'm just going to adjust my windows here. So this is Kismet. It initially is blank. So now the first thing I want to do is I want to right click, go to new variable, bool. And I'm going to keep its default value at false. And if you look under b value, 0 is false and 1 is true. So I'm going to leave it at 0. And for variable name, I'm going to name this left pokeball. So now with this variable selected, I'm going to hit Control C, Control V to paste it, paste the copy of it. And now I'm going to change its name from left pokeball to middle pokeball. So now I'm going to copy and paste another one, change its name to right pokeball. And then lastly, copy and paste one more time and change its name from middle pokeball, or whatever you have it to, change it to player has pokeball. So now these will represent whether or not the left pokeball has been picked up, or the middle pokeball has been picked up, or if the right pokeball has picked up, and whether or not the player has a pokeball. So what I'm going to do here now is hold Control and Alt, and then left click, drag a marquee selection, select all of them, and then when you have them all selected, press the C key to bring up a comment box. And I'm just going to name this variables. So now a box is created around our variables, so now that they're nice and separate from everything else that we're going to create. So I'm going to put that on the side. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the first trigger for the pokeballs right here, and I'm going to right click in empty space of the Kismet window with that trigger selected, drop down here to new event using trigger _2, and I'm going to do a used. And when a trigger is used, that means the player has to do input into the keyboard, and on default the input for used triggers is the E key. So I'm going to leave it at that. So now down in its properties, I want to go down to aim to interact. I want to keep that checked, and that means you basically have to aim the camera at the trigger in order to use it. And now the interact distance, I want to change that from 128. I'm going to change that to 32. Then scroll down and change max trigger count from 1 to 0. Because when a max trigger count is 0, this means that trigger can be used an infinite amount of times, not 0 times. So when a max trigger count is at 1, you can only use that trigger once. But when it's at 0, you can use it an infinite amount of times. And if you want to change the script anyway, you can change it in this regard. So maybe if you want this trigger to only be used 4 times, then you can change that to 4. But for this case, we're going to make sure we can use it an infinite amount of times. Next, we're going to need a node called switch. So I'm going to go to new action, switch, switch. Now I'm going to plug in the used output of our trigger used event and plug that into the in input of our switch. Now with our switch selected, I want to change a few things. The link count, I want to change that to 2. And then I want to check looping. So basically what a switch does is when a trigger is used, the first time it's used, the link 1 will be outputted into a series of events. So if the trigger is used once for the first time, I want the pokeball to disappear. And then when it's used the second time, I want that pokeball to reappear. So that's what that does. And since we're looping it, it'll go from, once you hit it once, it'll go through link 1. You use it twice, it'll go through link 2. Use it a third time, it'll go to link 1 again. Use it a fourth time, it'll go to link 2 again, and then so on from there. So when the player uses the trigger the first time, the first thing I want to do is I want to set the bool variable for the left pokeball to true. So I'm going to go to right click, new action, set variable, bool. So I'm going to plug link 1 into the in input of bool. And for value, I'm going to right click on this variable connector for value and go to create new bool variable. And I'm going to change its value from false to true by changing it from 0 to 1. And now the target is basically the variables that we want to become true at this point. And that's actually 2 variables that we want to become true. We want the left pokeball to become true, and we want the variable player has pokeball to become true. So instead of using these over here, I'm going to create new name variables to represent those variables. So right click, go to new variable, and go down to named variable. Now in its properties, under expected type, change it to seek var underscore bool, and then find var name, name this one left pokeball, and you should get a check mark. So now it knows it's linked to this left pokeball right here. Now Control C, Control V, a new copy of it, and then change it from left pokeball to player has pokeball. And you should get a check mark as well, because this one exists right here. So now plug both of those into the target. So what this is saying right now is that as soon as you use this trigger once, the value of both the left pokeball Boolean variable and the player has pokeball Boolean variable will go from false to true, which is good. And now what we want to do is we want to hide that pokeball once you use the trigger once. So I'm going to right click, go to new action, down to the bottom is toggle, look for toggle hidden. So now I'm going to plug in the output of that set Boolean variable into the hide input of the toggle hidden. Now I want to make the target the first left pokeball right here, so select that, right click on target and choose new object var using intervector _1. So now let's jump in real fast. Let's see if that works. Awesome. so that we see when we go in and we use the trigger, it will hide the pokeball. So now the next thing I want to do is plug in link to the output from that switch we made earlier. Plug that into unhide. And now let's go back in. And now as you can see, it'll go back and forth, which is what we want. Now what I also want to do is I'm going to hold Control Alt and marquee select the Boolean, the set Boolean variable node and the 3 variables associated with it. Select that, Control C, Control V, and I'm going to hit Alt. I'm going to hold Alt and then left click on the output just to disconnect it. So I'm going to move it over here. And what I want to do here is once link 2 is pressed with the trigger, I want to change the bool of the left pokeball and the player has pokeball back to false because the pokeball is placed back on the shelf. So I'm going to plug that into in, and then I'm going to change the true variable from 1 to 0 to make it false. Now the last thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need a normal toggle node. So I'm going to right click, go to new action, toggle, and then just toggle. So now I'm going to plug in the output of the toggle hidden node, plug that into turn off, and then I'm going to plug in the output of this set Boolean variable down here into turn on. And right now I'm going to leave it at this because we're going to connect future events to this, but right now we don't have those events right now. So I'm going to leave it as it is. So now I'm going to hit Control and hold Alt, and then left click drag a marquee selection, select all of them, and then I'm going to press the C key again. I'm going to name this left pokeball. So now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy this entire section, hit Control C, Control V, drag it down here, and I'm going to change the object comment to middle pokeball. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use the same exact sequence, but we just have to change what trigger is being used and what variables are being changed and what interactor is being changed. So select our trigger underscore 2 used, and then in our scene select the middle pokeball trigger, and then back here right click on the trigger 2 used event node and hit assign trigger underscore 3 to event. Now that'll just replace the yellow trigger with the new trigger. Very simple. Now with the left pokeball named variables, the 2 and on both set variables, I want to change that to middle pokeball. So change it from middle pokeball to middle pokeball. And you should get a check mark because we created those variables earlier. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to change the interactor being hidden and unhidden. So so select our middle pokeball, and then back in Kismet right click on an interactor that's connected to the target variable connector of the toggle hidden, and then assign interactor underscore 2 to object variables. So now we just replaced it. So now let's jump in really quick to make sure that works. As you can see, the first one's working and the second one's working. So that's good. So now I'm going to select all of these again and Control C, Control V one last time. I'm going to change the comment to right pokeball. And then I'm going to switch out the trigger again. So select your trigger in your scene. Then left click and then right click on your trigger 3 used event, and then assign trigger underscore 0 to events. And then for the middle pokeball named variables, change that to right pokeball. And then last but not least, we're going to change the interactor. So select the last pokeball, then right click on the interactor variable, and then assign interactor underscore 3 to object variables. So that should be good. So let's jump in real fast. Alright, so all 3 Pokeballs are working how we want them. Now that we got the use triggers working, I want to set up the touch trigger events for our Pokeball triggers so that when you initially go up to a Pokeball, it'll tell you press E to pick up a Pokeball. And then once you do have a Pokeball, once you go up to the empty space in the shelf where that Pokeball was, it should say press E to place Pokeball. So let's start with the left Pokeball. So let's select the trigger that represents our left Pokeball, select that in their scene, right click in our empty space of Kismet, and go down to new event using trigger_0 and do touch. So now we're going to have to change some of its properties, only one really, and that's the max trigger count. Change that to 0 so we can do this an infinite amount of times. Now what we're going to do is we're going to compare the state of each Pokeball, and based on the state it's in, different text will show up. So let's first find our compare bool node. So we're going to have to right click, go to new condition, comparison, compare bool. So I'm going to plug in the touched output of our trigger into the in input of our compare bool. Now the bool that we want to compare is our left Pokeball Boolean variable. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to find the name variable that represents our left Pokeball. I'm going to hit Control-C, Control-V, drag out, copy, and plug that in. For our result, we just need a blank default Boolean variable. So just right click on the connector and create new bool variable, and we'll just create a default false. So what happens here is once the trigger's touched, it'll check whether left Pokeball is true or false, and based on that we have outputs to do different actions. So first things first is we gotta create announcements to the player that will display text on the screen. So right click in empty space, go to new action, and then go down to voice announcements, and then play announcement. And we're going to display a text announcement. So in its properties, go down to announcement text and type in press E to place Pokeball. And now we're going to plug the true output of the compare bool into the in input of this play announcement node. And that's because if left Pokeball is true, that means they already picked up the Pokeball, and therefore the announcement should say to place the Pokeball back. So now with the play announcement node selected, hit Control-C, Control-V, create a new copy. Connect the false output of the compare bool into the play announcement of the newly created play announcement, and then change press E to place Pokeball to press E to pick up Pokeball. So now that we have it set up here, so when the trigger's touched, it'll check whether or not the left Pokeball has been picked up or not, and if it has, then we'll get an announcement saying you can place the Pokeball back. And if it hasn't been picked up, we'll give you an announcement that says you can pick it up. So now the last thing we want to do is we're going to compare one more Boolean. So Control-C, Control-V, the compare bool from before. And then hold down Alt and left click on all the outputs and the variable connectors just to disconnect everything. And then plug the output of the play announcement that's connected to the false. Plug that into the in of the new compare bool. And now we're going to compare the player has Pokeball Boolean variable and see if the player has a Pokeball or not. So I'm going to Control-C, Control-V a copy of the left Pokeball name variable, and I'm going to change its name back to player has Pokeball to represent the correct Boolean variable. Connect that to bool, and then for the result, just right click on and do create new bool variable. So now, if the player has Pokeball is true, meaning that they have a Pokeball, we want to play an announcement saying you can only carry one Pokeball at a time. So let's copy and paste the play announcement and change the announcement text to you can only carry one Pokeball, and then plug that into from the true. So that's set up. We're going to Control-C, Control-V this entire sequence, place it appropriately, And we're going to change the trigger so that now we're going to represent the middle pokeball. So take the middle trigger for the middle pokeball, right click on the trigger touch event, and assign trigger 3 to events. So now that's replaced. Now all we have to do is change the left pokeball variable to middle. And it's as simple as that. So hit Control V one more time, bring out a third duplicate of the sequence here. Change the touch trigger to the last trigger, and then change left pokeball to right pokeball. So now that's all set up. So I'm going to select all of it, position it where I want it, and then hit C on the keyboard, create a new comment, and I'm going to call this Pokeball Touch Events. So let's go in and let's double check our work. So we go up to a Pokeball. It tells us press E to pick up Pokeball. So we press E. Now the Pokeball's gone. And then we go up to it again and it says press E to place Pokeball. So we place it again and then it tells us to pick it up again. So let's pick it up one more time. Now let's go over here and now it's telling us we can only carry one Pokeball. So let's place this down again. So that's working. So one step I did not include until now is back here in our toggles for the initial used events. For the last toggle, we want to plug something into the event, and actually it's going to be two things. So it's going to get kind of confusing, but I'll walk you through it as best as I can. So for the left Pokeball sequence in the whole comment box, we want to plug this event into the two other used trigger events. So I'm going to plug this in to the middle Pokeball used event and into the right Pokeball used event. And then now for our middle Pokeball, under its toggle, we're gonna make the event. We're gonna toggle the event of the left Pokeball and the right Pokeball. And then lastly, for the right Pokeball, we're gonna connect the event from the middle Pokeball and from the left Pokeball. So basically what's happening here is that once you have a Pokeball in your possession, we turn off the used events for the other two Pokeballs. So say I pick up the left Pokeball. If I try to pick up the middle or right Pokeball, I won't be able to because it's turned off because I already have a Pokeball in my possession. So that's what really makes the you can only carry one Pokeball thing actually happen. Before, like if I didn't have that set up, it'll say you can only carry one Pokeball, but I can actually carry more Pokeballs because this event hasn't happened. But once I place a Pokeball back, the events are turned back on, so I can turn on so I can take Pokeballs again. So I'll show you how that works. Let's go back here. So press E to pick up Pokeball. I have a Pokeball now. Now if I press E to try to pick up another Pokeball, I can't do that. But I can place the Pokeball back. And once I place it back, I can pick up a Pokeball again. So that's how that works. Alright. Now that we have all the triggers for a Pokeball set up, let's start interacting with our door trigger. So now let's select the trigger that represents our door. Select that. Now go into Kismet, right click an empty space, and do new event using trigger _1 and do touch. So when the player touches the trigger for the door, we want to play an announcement telling them, press E to open the door if you have the correct Pokeball. So let's go in and do new action, new voice announcements, play announcement. And then under announcement text, we're going to do press E to open if you have the correct Pokeball. So under touched, the output of touch, plug that into the in-play announcement. I also forgot to mention, we're going to change the max trigger count of our triggered one touch event to 0 instead of 1, so this fires infinitely. So now that's our basic touch event. So let's go make sure that works. So once I touch the trigger, it'll tell me the rules. Press E to open. So that's working. So now I want to create a used event for the trigger so that we can open our door. So let's go in with our trigger selected. Let's do new event using trigger_1 and go to used. Now I want to do aim to interact, and let's change the interact distance from 128 to about 96. And then go down to max trigger count, and let's do 0. Just to speak about it, interact distance basically means the distance you have to be within the trigger to interact with it. So I want to do 96 units because that's how I figured out that's the best distance for it. So now when the trigger is used for the door, we want to check a bunch of things. We want to compare each pokeball Boolean variable to see which one the player has, and if the player has the right one, we want the door to open. If the player has the wrong pokeball, we want to tell them they have the wrong pokeball, and if they don't have any pokeballs, we want to tell them they don't have a pokeball. So first things first, we're going to need 3 compare Boolean nodes. So I'm going to go to new condition, compare bool, and then I'm just going to Control-C, Control-V, 3 copies of it. So the first compare bool, I'm going to compare the left pokeball. So I'm going to find a left pokeball name variable in the Kismet window. I'm going to Control-C, Control-V it, and then bring it back down here. I'm going to plug it into bool, and then for the result, I'm just going to right click to create new bool variable and just keep it default. For the second one, I want to do the middle pokeball. So Control-C, Control-V the left pokeball name variable and change its name to middle pokeball. Connect that, and then create a new bool variable. And then last but not least, I'm going to do the right pokeball. Plug that into the bool, and then for the result, create a new bool variable. So now I'm going to plug in the used output of the trigger used event, plug that into the in input of our first compare bool. So now what I want to have happen here is if this is false, meaning they don't have the left pokeball, I want to go into the next one. So now if the player doesn't have the left pokeball, we're going to check do they have the middle pokeball, and if they don't, we're going to check again if they have the right pokeball. So how this is working right now is we use the trigger, it checks if we have the left pokeball. If we don't, it checks if we have the middle pokeball. If we don't have the middle pokeball, it'll check if we have the right pokeball. Now if we don't have the right pokeball either, that's when we want to play an announcement saying, yeah, you don't have any pokeballs. So let's copy a play announcement, plug the false output of the very last compare bool into the in input of this newly created play announcement, and then under its announcement text property, let's write you don't have a pokeball. So let's see if that works. Let's go up to our door. It'll tell us this. We have to press E, so I'm going to press E, and it says you don't have a pokeball, which is true. I do not have a pokeball. So that's working. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create another play announcement. So I'm going to Control-C, Control-V this one. And in its announcement text, I want to write you have the wrong pokeball. So now what I want to connect this to is that if we do have the left pokeball, we want to connect the true to that because only the middle pokeball is the right pokeball. And then I also want to plug in the true for the third right pokeball into the in of this one as well. So now if we approach the door with either the left or right pokeball, it'll tell us we have the wrong pokeball, which is working for that. See if it's working for the last one. And it's working. So now that's working. We want a special event to happen once the player has the correct Pokeball. And that event is the door opening. So what I want to do is I want to create a new matinee. So right click, go to new matinee, and then double click the matinee node to open up matinee in a new window. And now with our door interactor selected in the content, not in the content browser, in our scene, right click in the gray space here and do add new empty group. I'm going to name it door underscore open. And then with our new empty group, right click it and go to add new movement track. So this allows us to move objects. So in our time tracker, slide this white bar to find this red bar and left click drag it to the left until you meet the 1 second mark. And this means the entire duration of our animation is going to be 1 second. So now we have this black bar that allows us to move on the time track, and then wherever you place this black bar, if you hit enter, it'll create a new keyframe. So I want this to be a keyframe at 1 second, and then with the keyframe selected, highlighted as it is, let's move our door upwards in our scene. Move it so it looks like it's open. And if you do it properly, you'll see this yellow dotted line, and if you move the bar back and forth, it will show the animation. And you can also go on top here, hit play, and you can see the door open. So that's working. So let me just move this to a good location. So now let's plug in true from the middle pokeball compare bool to play. Now this will mean if we have the middle pokeball, the door will open. So let's check it out. And it's working. Now the very last thing we want to do is once the player solves the puzzle, we want to destroy all our triggers so that the events cannot fire again. So let's select all the triggers in our scene and then go back in here in our Kismet window, right click, go to new action, actor, and then destroy. So this basically destroys whatever the target is, and our target is going to be all 4 of these triggers. So right click on the target variable connector and do new object bars using trigger _1, and then it just doesn't say the rest, but it does all 4 of them. Now that we have that set up, once the animation's done for the door, under completed, let's plug that in. Let me just maneuver things. So now that's it. So I'm going to create a new comment box, just call this door sequence. And that's the entire Kismet sequence. So let's jump in. And let's use the right pokeball and open our door. Now once we do that, we're not prompted anymore to pick up pokeballs. So that means everything is working. And that concludes this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot. I learned a lot. I had to do this from scratch, so I learned a lot in the process of doing this. In the description below, you'll find a link to my portfolio, the specific location in my portfolio that has the written tutorial in it, if you like written tutorials better. It has an example demonstration video of how this tutorial, how this Kismet script works, and it also has this video in it as well, and images of the Kismet sequence. So if anything was confusing along the way, go to that link and everything should be explained to you, or you can email me. My email will be on my portfolio if you have any questions. Also in the description you'll find links to the Afflicted, a project I'm working on, and you'll also find a link to the Network, which is another game I'm working on. And you'll also find a link to the Dropbox file where you'll be able to download the level and the level package that you'll need that has the Pokeball and the shelf. So everything will be there. So I hope you learned a lot, and thanks for watching.